Growing our mind is just as important as building our body, but trying to build our intelligence can actually backfire. If we're not careful, our very pursuit of knowledge and wisdom will become a toxic behavior that forever sabotages our growth. As both a former Ivy League student and as a peer-reviewed researcher, I fell into this trap, and this video is here to ensure you don't. And that trap is equating our knowledge to our self-worth. You see, back when I was in my undergrad, I was extremely intellectually curious. A high school teacher had introduced me to the study of philosophy, and from that point, I was hooked. I then majored in philosophy and history, and I devoted my heart and soul to my studies. I became that student, the one always lugging a pile of books around campus. I'd spend hours in the library each week, poring over every source I could find, convinced that my knowledge was the key to my growth. And it worked, at least at first. The more knowledgeable I became, the more it affected who I hung out with and how I saw myself. But here's where things started to go wrong. I began associating only with people I felt were equally knowledgeable. Conversations became more about proving myself right than learning. And I had this narrow and ultimately dumb idea of what an intellectual conversation was. Have you ever done this? Have you ever caught yourself sizing someone up based on what they know or don't know? I did this a lot, but I didn't realize that what I thought was a sign of intelligence was actually arrogance. And worse, it was blocking me from true growth. But as we'll see, this kind of behavior is deeply rooted in where we place our sense of self-worth, and as such, there's a way to prevent this all from happening in the first place. Dr. Jeremy Sherman, author of the book What's Up with Assholes, yes, that's the real book title, has categorized a series of character traits associated with what he calls, quite eloquently, a-holism. No, really, it's a real term and actually is a growing area of study in psychology. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm in no way calling you an a-hole. How could I? I don't even know you. But Sherman presents some key points in this book about certain character traits that can help us understand why I fell into this trap, and more importantly, how we all can avoid it. You see, without realizing it, I created a very narrow and in a very real sense, dumb definition of what being intellectual means. In reality, I was simply lying to myself. This had nothing to do with being intellectual. It had everything to do with being elitist and superior to others. It had everything to do with assuming possession of absolute truth and having the last word. This is what Sherman calls frame dominance. Imagine two people trying to paint a picture together, but each insists on holding the brush. It's a power struggle that ensures neither learns or grows. Frame dominance is when we become obsessed with controlling the narrative, to win the argument, to make others see things our way. And ironically, as we gain more knowledge, we reinforce this behavior. We start believing we're always right and others just need to catch up. You see the problem? People like Ben Shapiro demonstrate this clearly. If we listen carefully to what he says most of the time, we can hear it's often nothing more than artfully arranged word salad, designed to help him get the last word. And without realizing it, have you ever engaged in this kind of thinking or behavior? Well, let's explore this to see if you might be engaging in it right now. For instance, you might think, my taste in music is more sophisticated than most people, or even religious people are stuck in delusional fantasies. You might claim that both of these are rational statements, but as Sherman rightly points out, statements like these are more often than not a form of what he calls spin dominance, a way of speaking that disguises judgments as facts. You see, the words religious and fantasy do have literal meanings. This is what is called their denotation. But they also have connotations, meaning the emotions or moral judgments they imply. Do you see how speaking in these ways is no more constructive than saying things like, "Make America great again," or "Workers of the world unite"? These phrases are just as empty and simply contain a hidden agenda to demean others or gain superiority. As for myself, as I built my own elitist bubble, my sense of self-worth became more and more tied to my level of knowledge. Do you see the potential problem with this? Well, if someone discussed something I didn't know or understand, my ego would get just a little bit bruised. And sometimes I would even find myself pretending I knew certain things or had heard of certain ideas. So then if all of this is such a common trap that we can fall into on the path to gaining knowledge, what's the solution? Well, in Sherman's book, he emphasizes the importance of adopting what he calls fallibilism, and this concept is nothing new. In fact, in explaining this concept, he cites one of my favorite thinkers of all time, Karl Popper, and Popper's revolutionary idea of falsifiability. You see, Popper dug deep into the structure of how the scientific method works and emphasized that we can never verify that a scientific theory is correct. Instead, the best we can do is conduct repeated experiments with the aim of falsifying a theory. In other words, even in science, we can never make statements about the world or the universe which imply we somehow have absolute knowledge or have the final word. Instead, we can only make qualified, conservative statements such as XYZ is a predictively powerful model, until shown otherwise. But what does this all have to do with preventing ourselves from falling into an intellectual trap? Well, Sherman's idea of fallibilism highlights the importance of this attitude when it comes to growing ourselves, growing our intelligence, and having overall healthy interactions with people. As we grow our knowledge and increase our intelligence, we have to be more and more careful that we don't fall into an elitist bubble like I did. And fallibilism is an extremely useful way to avoid this. Fallibilism is essentially the admission that we can be, and indeed often are, wrong. We don't have a superior perspective. We don't have more advanced tastes. We might think we do, and we might even have good reason to think we do. But ultimately, fallibilism states that to be a good critical thinker is to, at the same time, doubt we're a good critical thinker. It is to recognize, as is the case in science, that we don't have the last word, that we don't possess absolute truth. We simply have a reasoned argument that seems true until further evidence shows it is not. In essence, it's about replacing the need to be right with the need to be curious. This way of thinking represents an attitude of humility, and as we'll see, can dramatically increase both our personal growth and our impact on others. You see, once we adopt this attitude, we can instantly remove the cap on our intelligence. And why? Well, by opening ourselves up to the vulnerability of, I might be wrong, we come to the immediate conclusion that the only way we will truly continue to grow our knowledge and intelligence is by listening. You see, the famous thinker Jürgen Habermas, author of The Theory of Communicative Action, argues this point in not only this book, but in all of his writings. As a German citizen having lived through the Nazi regime as well as the post-World War II aftermath, Habermas concluded that the Nazis had adopted the destructive attitude we've described here, but had taken it to its extreme. In Sherman's words, the Nazis were taking the position of infallibilism. Their ideas, their morality, their justice were superior and must be imposed on everyone else. To take a fallibilist approach then means developing the right motives. You see, in my own case, my own primary motive in conversation with others was to prove them wrong and show that I was right. In essence, once again, to build up my self-worth by demonstrating my supposed superiority. But according to Habermas, our motive in a conversation must not be manipulation, convincing, or some other strategy, but instead must be simply understanding the other person. There's an old Indian story about blind men who find an elephant, an animal they've never encountered before. Each of the blind men touch the animal from a different part. Some touch the tusks, some touch the legs, some touch the ears, and so on. Unsurprisingly, they all have different understandings of what an elephant is. And I believe this is exactly how our different perceptions of reality work. All of them may be true, but all of them may still miss something. But then, what about objective truth? Should we abandon that altogether? Habermas seemed to think so, but I disagree. Just because there are different perspectives doesn't mean there still isn't one elephant. You just shouldn't be an a-hole about it. And the key to doing this is, as I stated at the beginning, to stop equating our knowledge and our self-worth. But how? What should we tie to our sense of self-worth? Well, I believe there are 3 character traits, which we could even call virtues, that serve as a great substitute for tying our self-worth to our level of knowledge. And those are 1, curiosity, 2, openness, and 3, vulnerability. With curiosity comes the desire to ask questions and understand others' perspectives. With openness comes the willingness to consider that others' ideas might be better than yours. And with vulnerability comes the acceptance of the possibility of being wrong. To take even the most extreme example, let's say someone says the Earth is flat. We have more than enough evidence to know that this is absurd. But having curiosity and openness means, in this situation, trying to understand why the person believes this, asking questions to find out what their thought process is. And by not immediately rushing to judge them, and instead trying to understand them by practicing these 3 virtues, we can firmly rest our sense of self-worth on this. You see, while getting the last word makes us feel safe, superior, and secure, long-term, the exact opposite is true. By embracing uncertainty, I feel I've developed an even greater sense not only of freedom, but also compassion. And I believe you can too. If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.